Okay, got it. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a thrill it is to be here. I'm so glad to see all of you here. Before we get started with the presentation, however, I'm a photographer. Everybody say B&H. There, nice pano. I love the pano feature on this camera. I'd like to begin today by thanking David and B&H and all the sponsors who have made this possible. What a fabulous event this is. And thank all of you for being here too and allowing me to share some ideas about photography and the creative process. As David said, if you're not familiar with me, I hope to introduce you to lens work through the magazine that you have in your swag bag and a little bit of my comments today. I begin this afternoon with a simple assertion, and that assertion is that today, right now, is the best time in the entire history of photography to be a photographer. And aren't we all just reveling in that opportunity that we have? Think of the advantages that we have that previous generations of photographers have not had. For example, equipment. I mean, we're here surrounded by equipment with the B&H event. The equipment that we have available to us is so spectacular. It's the kind of things that previous generations would have only dreamt about. Think of all the processes that you can do. If you want to do daguerreotypes, you can do daguerreotypes. You can do tintypes. The daguerreotype photographers could only do daguerreotypes. We can do digital prints. We can do platinum, palladium, gelatin, silver. What a fantastic time to be a photographer. Think about all the books that we have that we can view, right? I just spent yesterday afternoon at the Strand bookstore. Those of you who are in the New York area, oh my God, am I jealous. What a fabulous bookstore, and so many books. I mean, we're surrounded by these wonderful images of people who have gone before us. Then there's the museums. Have you been to the Irving Penn exhibit yet at the Met? We went the other day, and I have to tell you, I failed in my attempt to absorb all that Irving Penn had to offer because there was simply so much to see. It was so inspiring to realize that such a great photographer had gone before us. And of course, then we live in the age of the internet, a time in which we can propel our images out into the world like no other generation could do it. What a fantastic time to be a photographer. But of all the things, if that wasn't persuasive enough, that convince us this is a great time to be a photographer, there is also the pioneers who have gone before us. Those generations of photographers who have shown us the way, who can teach us the way through their examples, through their teaching. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. When Maureen and I started Lenswork 25 years ago, we knew that there was a world of inspiration available for photographers, and that became our mission, was to try to provide that in the form of portfolios and articles. And so we publish a print version, a tablet version, and a computer version, and we've done a number of books on photography and the creative process. We're one of the few magazines, photography magazines, that is about photographs rather than about cameras. We don't do any camera reviews or anything like that. I have a podcast, long-running podcast. Matter of fact, I did my first podcast back when podcasts hadn't even been invented yet. I didn't know what to call them. I called it an audio blog. And about 6 months later, Apple introduced the word podcast to the world. So I can honestly say I was podcasting before podcasting was podcasting. And there's 1,000 now podcasts we've done. I still can't believe I've come up with that much to talk about, but I feel like I'm just getting started. So what I would like to do is share with you just a few of the people who have inspired me from a book that I'm currently writing that will be out later this year called Those Who Inspire Me and Why. And the first person that I need to single out as one of the great inspirations in my creative life is Maureen Gallagher, who is not only my co-editor, but my co-partner in life. We were married 25 years ago, and that's Maureen right there. Hello. In the mid-1980s, I was involved in a group, photo group in Portland, Oregon. We would get together on a monthly basis and share our work and do mutual critiques. I'm sure many of you are involved in this kind of group. And I had volunteered to be the newsletter editor of our local photo group to announce to people when the next meeting was going to be and that kind of thing, primarily because I wanted to learn this new thing that had just come out into the world called desktop publishing. And I thought that I needed to know about desktop publishing. It doesn't matter what you don't know, it matters what you commit to. So I committed to learn desktop publishing. I purchased a program called Publish It, which you have to say very slowly. And threw myself into the process, and it wasn't too long after that, a number of years later, I met Maureen, who convinced me that there were things in life more important than publishing. And in one particular evening, we were folding and stapling and applying mailing labels to the photo group newsletter. And she said, well, here's someone who lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin or somewhere, wherever it was, long ways from Portland, Oregon. And she said, why would this person be a member? And I said, oh, they used to live in Portland and they moved to Wisconsin, but they still are a member of the group. And she said, well, why would they want to be a member of the local photo group? And I said, I don't know, maybe because of the content of the newsletter. I discovered when I volunteered to do the newsletter that the problem is once you get past the next meeting is Tuesday at John's house, there's not much else to put in the newsletter, so I started writing some things. And she said, well, you mean people like what you're writing? I said, well, I guess they must. And she said, well, maybe we should think about starting a publication to share more of your writing. So we bought a press. That's what you do, right? Here's a picture of our beloved Elvis Presley. And me learning how to put ink on, hopefully, a little bit of the paper, but mostly me. Notice the inspiring leg in the background. That came from Maureen's photography studio. And on the very back wall, you can barely see it, is a Win Bullock poster. Win Bullock was one of my original inspirations, and he's been with me my entire career. We started publishing lens work in 1993. We're approaching our 25th anniversary. We now have subscribers in 73 countries. Like I say, Lenswork is all about photography and the creative process, not about cameras. Since then, we've, I suppose to brag just a little bit, we've gone on to win 5 Benny Awards, the Benjamin Franklin Printing Awards, which are kind of the Oscars of the printing industry for the quality. We're the only magazine that prints in museum quality printing, duotone. We emphasize high quality. We want to make something that lasts. So that's a little bit about me. I'm also a photographer. I've been a photographer long before I was a publisher, and I will be a photographer right up until the time, well, Ansel used to say, right up until the time he went into the final wash. But I've updated it, and I say, oh, I'm going to be a photographer until I go into the ink maintenance tank. But along with Maureen, who taught me the value of jumping in, it doesn't matter what you don't know, just commit to it and do it. And she's been with me every step of the way in this 25-year adventure. That lesson, I think, pertains equally well to photography, to art making, to the task of trying to do something that we haven't done before. You just jump in and you give it your best, and you learn along the way. One of the people that I learned from fairly quickly was Ansel Adams. We probably all learned a little bit from Ansel Adams. But one of the things that I learned from Ansel Adams is not what you would expect. This is the kind of thing most of us learned from Ansel Adams. You make a fabulous image, you put it in a white bevel cut mat board, you number it, Ansel used big numbers. And it helps to sell such work if you're a famous dead guy. Now, by the way, in truth, this is not one of Ansel's images. This is one of mine for copyright reasons. I'm substituting it in there. And fortunately, I can say that this print doesn't sell because I'm not a famous dead guy yet. But who knows, someday it might. But that's not really what I learned from Ansel Adams. Although, like many of you, I learned about printing in the darkroom and what a good print was and all those kinds of things. The real lesson that I learned from Ansel Adams is the difference between an image and a print. You know, Ansel had no, I can use his first name because he's dead, you see, so we're like good friends. Ansel taught us that a print is one thing. That was his original artwork, but he was not hesitant to take his images and put them on all kinds of things, right? He put them on posters and on calendars and on appointment books, and even once he put it on a coffee can for advertising purposes. He understood the difference between an image and a print. What a valuable lesson for us to have in this age of changing media. Just to prove the point about changing media, let me ask you a question. How many of you are still using the same camera today that you were using, say, 30 years ago? I didn't think so. One, hey, good for you, congratulations. You know, the media is changing, our equipment is changing, and as a result of that, we now need to think a little more extensively. The mat board is a fine way to present work, and certainly if you're involved in galleries, if you want to put your work on the wall, that's a terrific thing to do. But a print is a different thing than an image. And in this age in which we live, if we can let go of the print to some degree and start thinking about what we produce as images, all kinds of possibilities open up. We'll talk more about those in just a minute. The next inspiring person I want to talk about is Jerry Ullsman, who, again, taught a different lesson than you might expect. Do you know Jerry Ullsman and his work? Yeah. Jerry Ullsman, contemporary photographer, teaches in Florida. He, a terrific, very well-known photographer. He does what is now called recombinant imagery. He was doing Photoshop tricks before Photoshop was Photoshop. And he will take images together and combine them into very dreamy kinds of things, etc. Jerry Ullsman, here's a picture of Jerry and Maureen at a conference years ago. I interviewed Jerry Ullsman for an early issue of Lenswork. And I asked him, I said, when you're out in the world with your camera and you're photographing, I said, are you thinking in your mind's eye about the recombinant combinations that you will create later down the road? Do you photograph specific things because you know you'll use them in a specific way? He said, no. He said, no, I don't do that at all. He said, when I'm out in the world, all I'm doing is gathering assets. And that just struck a chord with me. The idea that the artwork takes place in the field is a very Ansel Adams idea. The idea of pre-visualizing and perfectly composing. Ansel Adams would know precisely how he was going to develop film and make a print and etc. in the darkroom because he had to see it before he clicked the shutter and make decisions along the way. Jerry Ullsman uses exactly the opposite approach. When he's out in the world, he's just gathering assets, having no idea what he's going to do with them. The artwork happens later. And that, to me, was a tremendous revelation. The idea that we could, as photographers, just respond to the world intuitively, without thinking too hard about what we're doing, gathering assets to create the artwork later. Here's Maureen and I at a World War I battery installation on the Puget Sound, where the park rangers had covered up all of this graffiti with these strange brushstrokes. To me, it looked like Oriental calligraphy. And I made an image, captured it, for doing something with it later. And what that something is, I'll talk about in a few minutes. But I had no idea why I was capturing all of this graffiti. I just knew that it was fascinating, and I wanted to capture it. Here I am standing in front of a little splash of paint, and if you look carefully, you'll identify that splash of paint as the cover of 3 of my books. That's what I mean. You never know how you're going to use an image or in what context. Sometimes I convert images from photographs to backgrounds. Sometimes I combine them with things, although I don't do a lot of recombinant imagery. But most of the time, what I do is gather assets, get them back in Lightroom or on contact sheets, and then I start thinking about what can I do, how do I want to use this in a project, what do I want to say with my artwork, and then I start mining my assets for putting together projects. Well, how do you find a project in your assets? How do you go through your images and discover what it is that you want to say as an artist? David Bales taught me the most marvelous technique. If you get one thing out of today's talk, this is the one you should get right here. David Bales may be familiar to some of you. He's the co-author with Ted Orland of this marvelous book called Art and Fear, Observations on the Perils and Rewards of Art Making. Are any of you familiar with that book? A few. Okay, the rest of you, it's a mandatory purchase. You have to go buy this book and read it. It's a very short book. It'll only take you the rest of your life to understand it, because it is fabulous. David is just a brilliant workshop instructor and a photographer, and he taught me the most interesting technique in a workshop that I did with him back in the 80s. And it had to do with how do you find the project. That is one of the most troublesome questions, I think, for all of us photographers. We buy the equipment, we learn the mechanics of the camera, we learn processing and all that kind of stuff, and eventually, after we've done that for a while, we come up against that deadly question, now what should I photograph? And the search for things to photograph becomes sometimes one of the greatest challenges. You go out and you photograph all the obvious stuff first, and then you realize that everybody else has photographed all the obvious stuff, and so now what I photograph next? David had the solution for this, and it works something like this. He said, take all of your images and put them in a giant pile, which you can easily enough do in Lightroom, and you can do this with collections. But if you're still doing physical prints, just get a pile of prints. And he said, divide the single pile into 2 piles based on some criteria. And the criteria could almost be arbitrary. For example, you could take all the photographs that are closer than 10 feet and put them in this pile, and all the photographs that are farther than 10 feet and put them in this pile. And just divide your pile up, he said, and then see if anything happens to you. If nothing happens, don't worry. Put them all back in a pile and come up with a new criteria. Here's all the ones that are horizontal compositions, landscapes. Here's all the ones that are vertical or portrait compositions. Divide it up. See if anything happens to you. If it doesn't, put them back in a pile, come up with another criteria. Here's all the ones that have rectilinear compositions, straight up and down. Here's all the ones that have arcs and curves and S-shapes. Divide the pile and see if anything happens to you. He said, and I'm telling you, it's absolutely true, you may have to do this 30 or 40 times, but eventually, in the process of dividing your pile of prints, something will click, and the hair on the back of your neck will stand up, and you'll go, oh, there it is. It's been right in front of me all the time. You just didn't know it was there. I often think about it this way. You're wandering through the world with your camera. Think of all the things you walk past that you don't photograph. But then you see something and you go, oh, that's it. I want to photograph that. Why did you choose that thing to photograph? What was it about that thing that caught your eye and said, I'm going to make that picture? Well, we don't always know. Sometimes this is happening on a very deep subconscious level. We're reacting to the world. We're using intuitive thinking rather than analytical thinking. And all of those images exist in our archives. The projects are not in the world, the projects are in your archives, and you can find them this way. So, as an example, I was mentioning this graffiti that had been painted over in Fort Worden. Miles and miles of cement walls, and some very creative park rangers who were covering up the swear words and whatnot with these fanciful brushstrokes. And I have like 800 abstracts of graffiti. What do you do with 800 abstracts of graffiti? I mean, somehow you have to organize them into some group that's held together. And so I'm trying this, you know, with the verticals and the horizontal, and I'm getting nowhere. I've done about everything I can think of. And then I saw this image. Oh, I point at the screen like you guys can see. Point at that image, okay? And I thought, this looks kind of like Japanese or Chinese calligraphy. It looks like the figure 1. And so that became a division strategy for my pile of 800 abstracts. Looks like Oriental calligraphy, doesn't look like Oriental calligraphy. And obviously there were lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of them that didn't, but there were quite a number of them that did. And the more I started seeing those and separating them out, I realized I had a project, because they looked like writing, but clearly they weren't. They were just random brushstrokes that they were making. But it got me thinking about the first time I went to Japan. I had studied Japanese a bit with an interpreter for a while, trying to learn some rudimentary Japanese, which I realized was going to be useful in conversation. But when I landed in Japan, I unexpectedly realized that I was absolutely illiterate. I couldn't read anything. And that's what I felt like looking at all these abstracts. That it was as though there was language, but I couldn't read it. And it got me thinking about the process of not being able to read or understand language. So I made this project called Wakarimasen, which is Japanese for I don't understand. The search for meaning in an unknown language. And I put together a group of 15 of these images in a little art paper cover. It creates what I call a folio. Not intended for the wall, intended to be sort of folios. How do I describe folios? They're kind of halfway between an original print, in that they are original prints, halfway between that and books. A book is a collection of images that are bound together. Well, I make folios for my artwork. One of the things I do is folios that are collections of prints, but they're not bound. They're loose. They're held together in an art paper cover. And I've discovered this to be a terrific medium. So anyway, I made this project called Wakarimasen. And based on discovering the project that David Bales had taught me to see. The next person I want to talk about who has been an inspiration in my life is not a photographer at all, but is Hokusai. Hokusai is made great Japanese artwork. Probably most of you have seen this image. If you don't know this image, they actually have one at the Met. It's a fabulous ukiyo-e print, a woodblock print. But Hokusai, I got to thinking a lot about Japanese ukiyo-e prints, because they were sort of the photography of their days. They're not photography, they're woodblock prints, and so there's differences. But they did something that I thought was fascinating that we have not done with photography. The Japanese ukiyo-e artists recognized that they could make lots and lots of these, and they were sold for literally fractions of a penny in the Japanese money of their day. Hokusai taught me about the value of inexpensive artwork. I blame Stieglitz, quite honestly. Stieglitz was a wonderful, valued asset in photographic world, but you know, Stieglitz, when he tried to figure out how to do something interesting with photographs to elevate them and to make them artwork, he cast about and he said, what do photographs kind of feel like? And he said, they kind of feel like painting. And so if we treat them the way we do paintings, that is to say, we put them in a frame and we hang them on the wall, then there's a way to make them, through association, become more valuable than mere photographs. The problem with that is that they're also not like paintings in that photographs can be replicated easily, paintings cannot. That they are a truly democratic art form. Paintings are, you have to be pretty talented to do that, where lots and lots of us can enjoy photography. Hokusai understood that inexpensive photographs can get out into the world in a way that expensive artwork can't, and he sold gazillions. So I followed his lead. I have a whole series of inexpensive prints that I make. I watched what Ansel Adams did with his Ansel Adams Special Collections edition that you can buy in Yosemite for a fraction of an Ansel Adams print price. And I thought, you know, that's a great idea, because what I want to do with my photography is get it out into the world. That's what I really want to do. I want to share, and I want to take what I've created and have lots of people see it. So I make a series of very inexpensive prints, thanks to the lessons from Hokusai. That's a very short leap, obviously, to my next inspired individual, Charles Dickens. What does Charles Dickens have to do with photography? Well, on the surface, it doesn't look like much. But he gave me an idea that has turned out to be spectacular. And that was his very first book. Charles Dickens' first book was called Sketches by Boz. That was his pen name at those times. He worked for a newspaper. And the newspaper said, go out into London and look for little scenes that you could write about, a sketch. Just show us something. And so he would write, 1,000 words or something about a Hackney coach stand, or people drinking in a pub, or etc. And these were illustrated. Oftentimes there's some illustrations from Sketches by Boz. But he would craft these little stories that didn't have a beginning, middle, and end. They weren't a morality tale, they were a sketch. It was a look at something. Gosh, does that sound familiar? As photographers, isn't that kind of what we do? We wander around the world and we find something interesting and we use our cameras to create a little sketch of that. It's what I call storytelling without a plot. Here's an example. I was in China. I had been invited by a group to come there. They said, would you like to have an exhibition at the Zhongshuan Art Palace? I said, oh, are you kidding? I'd love to. That'd be fantastic. And they said, and we'd like you to come for the opening. I said, oh, fantastic. I'd like to come. Where is the Zhongshuan Art Palace? They said, it's up on the edge of the Gobi Desert. I said, oh, cool. Can I bring my camera? Oh, yes. We'll give you plenty of time to photograph. Of course, I'd love to be there. The one question I failed to ask was, when was it? And it turns out it was the first 2 weeks in January. It was real cold. And we were wandering around. I had decided I wanted to photograph a fishing village. So I had told my translators, is there any chance we can get to a photograph fishing village? They said, oh yeah, there's one just down the road. I thought a fishing village was going to be the Yellow River with some lovely boats and, I had all these images in my mind. Oh no, that's not what fishing is in China. In fishing in China, they take what you and I would call a cornfield, they plow it about 3 feet deep, fill it up with water, throw in a bunch of carp, and then a year later they drain it and walk around and pick up all the fish. That's fishing in China, and these were the guys who did that. But keep in mind, it's like 17 degrees below zero, and it was unbelievably cold. And so we're driving around, and we're in this village, and there's no one on the streets because it's so cold. And I saw a building with a torn poster, and I thought, oh, I want to photograph that because the world doesn't have enough torn poster photographs. And I jumped out of the cab and set up to make this photograph, and these guys came running out, and said, "Oh, you must come inside," through the translator, "you must come inside and get warm." So we went inside the store, and come to find out, this is the village market. And it's so identified because on the right side, behind where these guys are, is where all the cigarettes are, and on the left side of the door is where all the white lightning is, and that's the store. So that tells you. But notice they do have a little corn cob stove here that they're using to keep warm. And so we're chitting and chatting with them through the translator, and all of a sudden this guy, second from the right, stops and stares right at me and sits up nice and straight like he wants a portrait done. Well, I'm no fool. Of course I'm going to make this guy's portrait. So in a fraction of a second like that, boom, I get the portrait. Now, the translator, in the meantime, had gone into another room with one of the other photographers, so I'm left there by myself, and I'm dying to ask this guy, what happened that has given you a glass eye and a wooden hand? But I don't speak any Mandarin, he doesn't speak any English, and I have no way to communicate and ask such questions. But nonetheless, we connected in this photograph, eye to eye, for a moment. And he will forever be a part of my life, right? This is the power of photography. So I put together what I call a chapbook. This is a little handmade artist book with a little story, and you can see here's the story of their fishing village and the picture of the group, and then here's the portrait, and then we discovered why they were all together was to play mahjong and while away the winter cold hours in the store. So that's what Charles Dickens gave me. A story without a plot, a sketch, a moment that we can capture. Sometimes maybe one picture, sometimes maybe 5 or 6 or 7 pictures. But what a great thing that the camera can do is to capture and make connections even though we don't have language. Which brings me to the 7th group of people that I want to talk about is the Japanese poet Basho. You all know Basho from haiku and all of that. And Ernest Hemingway. What do Basho and Ernest Hemingway have to contribute to us photographers? Well, Ernest Hemingway encapsulated this idea perfectly. It's one of my favorite quotes from Orson Welles. The enemy of art is the total lack of limitations. When you can do anything, which nowadays as photographers we can do just about anything we want to do, anything we can imagine, we have the tools to do. But when you can do anything, what that often does is just ball us up to where we can't figure out what we want to do. Sometimes limitations can be very handy, and that's what Basho and Hemingway give us. Ernest Hemingway was once challenged, this is an apocryphal story, but I think it's true. Ernest Hemingway was once challenged, could he write a novel in 6 words? Do any of you know about 6-word stories? Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. He was challenged, can you write a novel in 6 words? It's a bar bet. He said, yeah, of course I can write a novel in 6 words. They said, go ahead. He said, it's easy. Baby shoes, for sale, never worn. Powerful, isn't it? Yeah. Basho is related to Hemingway because Basho wrote haiku poetry that always had, every time, exactly 17 syllables. Once we can find and create some kind of constraint on our artwork, strangely enough, it doesn't constrain us, it liberates us. It's a bit of a challenge. It gives us form and structure. And once we have form and structure, creating our artwork becomes more interesting. So a couple of years ago, I had this strange idea about 6-word stories and Basho and etc. And we decided last year to launch a contest based on my experience of trying to do that. Here was my experience. This was my experience going to family reunions in North Dakota. Maureen's family is all Norwegian farmers, and so we would go back there to various family reunions, and I would always take my camera, and I'm wandering around photographing, you know, the barns and the tools and the machine shops, and in this case, Uncle Kenny's hands. And so I got a reputation in the family of being a photographer. One day I was out in the shop, and Uncle Kenny came walking out. Old farmer, kind of bent over. And I noticed that he was really dressed up. He had on a nice pair of slacks and a nice shirt. And I thought, well, it's not Sunday. He's not going to church. I wonder what is Uncle Kenny so dressed up for? And he walked up to me and he said, well, I suppose you're going to want to be making a portrait of me now. How do you turn that down, right? He said, I know exactly where I want to pose. And he walked over and sat down on this little thing that was in his shop, and I made the portrait, and I thought, aha, I can put together a small group of 6 images and tell the story of Kenny. The one on the right is Kenny and Palma's going to church shoes that we found in the bottom of their closet after they had both passed away. I thought, what a great little story. And I thought it was going to be just a story for my family, for my wife's family. Come to find out, lots and lots of people have an Uncle Kenny in their lives somewhere. And this turned out to be a very popular story. It's the idea of, can you tell a story in a limited number of images? So rather than one image, rather than a book that's a project, that can be a rather intimidating thing to put together, we thought, why not put together a project to challenge people with 6 image stories? Can they put together a 6-image presentation that tells a little story of some kind, or a sketch, the Charles Dickens kind of sketches by Boz sort of thing. So we published this book last year. We had a couple thousand people entered this. We had room for 50 of them in the book, and people loved the project. It was just great. So we're doing it again this year. Here's just a few examples of 6-image stories. Unfortunately, we can't read the text because it's too small, but the text was pertinent to the project. This is one called The Fog of Desert by a photographer named Jim Hans. An unusual morning. He made these photographs literally in a very short period of time. A fascinating palette, a wonderful view of the desert. My contention is you couldn't tell this story with one image, but you don't need a book, right? 6 is just the sweet amount. Here's another project from Lev Zimring, who I think lives here in New York. Photographing dogs in the city. And again, you could have 80 of these in a book, but they might get a little repetitive, but one of them doesn't do the job. But you put together 6 of them, and wowee, it's a fun little thing. So we're publishing another Seeing in Sixes this year, and we're publishing another Seeing in Sixes this year, and if any of you are so interested in doing it, the deadline is June 15th. We're right around the corner. But even if you don't want to enter the Seeing in Sixes book publication deal, think about trying this yourself. How many things do you have that are worthy of more than one image, but too many becomes, it dilutes the story? Constrain yourself, like the 6-image story, or maybe you might want 8 images or 10 images. But think about trying an experiment to put together a whole series of things that are contained with a finite number of images. The 8th photographer I want to talk about is Wright Morris. Wright Morris was more known as a novelist than as a photographer, but he is a terrific photographer. Passed away a number of years ago. Wright Morris, he had a wonderful monograph done by the Friends of Photography. Some of you maybe have seen that. It came out years and years ago. But here's the interesting story about Wright Morris. Wright Morris went to photograph his family farm in Kansas in the late 40s, early 50s, something like that. He spent, I think, a month or so there photographing 4x5, black and white, large format work, very sort of FSA-ish, if you will. He then published a book called The Home Place. That's the one on the left. And he wrote fictionalized text to go with the image. Fictionalized about being a farmer in the Dust Bowl era, and et cetera, et cetera. A few years later, he used exactly the same images and published another book called The Inhabitants with a different set of text. What a strange concept that was. And then, a few years later, in the early 60s, published using many of the same images, God's Country and My People, with another different set of text. Who said photography has to be true? Now, let's set documentary aside, but as artists, if we're making personally expressive fine art photography, why does it have to be true? Maybe some of you are writers, maybe some of you are poets. Can you use your photography as a launching point to create something that's fictionalized? Or if not fictionalized, it at least uses image and text. I was taught as a young photographer that any photograph that needs text needs to be a better photograph. You know, you're not supposed to use text. Well, that's probably true if you want to limit yourself. There's a famous old story that I'm sure some of you have heard, that Edward Weston was once sent a book galley for him to proof and approve before the book was published. And it came in an envelope that was addressed Edward Weston, comma, artist. This incensed Edward. He thought, no. And when he sent the galley proofs back, he scratched off the word artist and he wrote in above it, photographer. And that's supposed to be a positive statement for photography. And I've heard this quoted many times about how we photographers should be proud of being photographers. And there's an argument for that, too. That's true. But I think he got it exactly backwards. I think as photographers, what we really are, at least those of us who are doing personally expressive photography, is we are artists. We just happen to use a camera. And if we're an artist who happens to use a camera, there's no reason you can't use image and text. I discovered this because this is the kind of thing I often love to photograph. And I discovered fairly quickly it doesn't look that good above the fireplace. People don't want this on their walls, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. It doesn't mean I can't do something with it. I had to do something different. So I ended up making this a project I call Made of Steel. It's all about machine shops and tools and greasy guys and mechanics. My grandfather was one of these, so in some regards it's childhood memories. This is a folio of prints. This guy in the center, I'll have a bigger image of this in tomorrow's talk, but the text that goes with this one, he was a metal scrap salvager, so it says metal scrap salvager is the title of the image. He spit, swore, and asked me if I wanted a cup of tea. Now, see, doesn't that give him character now? It's as, gosh, I think it was Paul Caponegro. Paul, if it wasn't you, I apologize, said, it's one thing to take a picture of someone that's a portrait of what they look like. It's a much higher order of thing to take a portrait that tells us a little bit about who they are. Well, how do you get, he spit, swore, and offered me a cup of tea, in a photograph? That's hard to do, but you can add the text, and suddenly the text and the image go together. My entire book, Made of Steel, is this kind of thing. Image with small little quotes, comments, text, and it enlivens the photography. My ninth photographer is Minor Wright, probably most famous for his saying, don't photograph what it is, photograph what else it is. Think about photography not as mere documentation, although that's a lovely use of it, but think about photography as a mirror. His great book is called Mirrors, Messages, and Manifestations. What else can a photograph be? So here's a rather lifeless, unimaginative photograph of a tidal slough that I made years ago. I have several hundred of these. I don't know why. You know, you see something, you photograph it, you say, I can't not photograph it, you just keep photographing it because something deep in us sparks a creative muse and we decide we want to do something with it. But using Jerry Ullsman's idea that when we're in the field, all we're doing is gathering assets, I photographed away and I didn't worry about it. I figured out I'll learn what the art is later. And I started doing what I call PBPA, photography by pooping around. You know, just, I'm in Lightroom and I'm just playing, you know, doing stuff. I mean, it's Lightroom, right? You can undo it. So I'm playing around and I did an extreme contrast version of it and I got that. And suddenly it wasn't a tidal slough. What is it? It's like outer space, it's the universe. I got fascinated with the macro being visible in the micro, and I realized on a subconscious level I must have understood that when I was photographing. Or I got lucky. Where it comes from, who knows? Sometimes art, the genesis of art is a mystery. But the point is, once I had the idea, then I could go back and start working lots of the other images, looking for the ones that looked cosmic. And I ended up putting together a little project called Worlds Within Worlds. Every photograph has the potential to be some sort of metaphor. Don't photograph it for what it is, photograph it for what else it is. This, to me, just felt somehow like worship of some kind or another, like these trees are, you know, holding their arms up to the moon. I don't know. This seemed like, you know, the perils of life. Here's this poor little seagull, you know, this far above the water, and who knows what's lurking down there. Okay, I have a sick mind, but they're metaphors. Think about your photographs not as mere documentations. A camera, although it makes a fantastic Xerox machine, when it comes to making artwork, what we need to do is move beyond the Xerox machine and start thinking about how our photographs address the bigger issues. Number 10 is Todd Walker. He's a relatively obscure photographer, passed away a number of years ago. I can't remember now when. Any of you know Todd Walker? Todd was a fascinating artist. He wanted to have some books published of his work, but he couldn't find a publisher who was willing to publish them. So he thought, oh, heck with it. He bought himself a press. Matter of fact, he had the same press that we used back in the early days of Lenswork. He bought a press, and he would make his own books. I asked him when I interviewed him, how many books do you produce? He says, I don't know, I start off with 500 sheets of paper and I run the blue and then I run the yellow and then I run the cyan. And when it's all said and done, I might have 3, you know, because they get boogered up along the way. He decided to pursue self-publication. Now, self-publication is one thing, but what I discovered was an even deeper hidden lesson in Todd Walker's approach of self-publication, and that is what I call the value of momentum. There was a time in my life when I would go out photographing every year during vacation. And it doesn't work, because when your photography is that infrequent, there's a problem. And I decided, gosh, you know, I've got to get more disciplined. So I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to set up time to do photography. I'm going to be in the darkroom every Tuesday and Thursday night and every Saturday. And then I thought, no, I'm not. There's no way with all the other obligations of life I can possibly keep that kind of discipline. So I thought, okay, I'll only Thursday nights and every other Saturday. And I thought, no, I can't do that either. Okay, one weekend a month, I'll do it. And then I realized, you know, maybe, but even that. Okay, one Saturday a month, and then I felt comfortable. I can commit to one Saturday of photography every month and still take care of all my other life obligations and whatnot. And then I thought, wait a minute, that means I'm only going to do photography 12 times a year? and I consider myself a photographer, I realized the problem was I was trying to differentiate my life, to separate it between my life and my art life. And that anytime we do that, we can't possibly succeed. Somehow there has to be the ability to integrate our life so that we are creating a strategy for ourselves that has momentum. In my case, that's taken the form of this publication I call Kokoro, which I produce every month. It is consisted of little things, oftentimes like the 6-image thing I was talking about earlier, or the small little stories or text or poem, and it might have 4 or 5 or 6 of those in it at once. But by doing one on a regular basis, it keeps me doing big projects from time to time and little projects from time to time, but they end up being published here as a PDF. So this is my own magazine. So rather than wait for some magazine editor, like me, to say, yeah, okay, we'll publish your work, just do your own. Do your own PDF, do your own website or whatever. Become your own publisher. Here's an example of one project called Glimpses of Old Japan with a number of different images. The bottom line is this. I've gone through 10 people who have inspired me fairly substantially, changed the course of my artistic life. My proposal to you is that there are examples like this everywhere. That the more we keep our eye out for them, the more we can find inspiration in things that have nothing to do with photography, in things that have nothing to do with our art life, in things that maybe we would never expect an inspiration to come, but if we pay attention to them, there are little lessons here. Or as Isaac Newton said, if I've seen further than others, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. So what I'm doing is in the process of writing these little anecdotes down. Here's a list of the people who are going to be in the upcoming book, and you've just heard a few of these stories. The inspiration comes from everywhere if we can open up our creative muse and listen to it. Make sense? Okay, that is a sample of those who inspire me and why. Thank you. Thank you so much.